In the shadowed halls of Greystone Manor, a priceless ormolu clock, a golden heirloom of the Winthrop family, vanishes during a grand reunion. Suspicion falls on a charming cousin drowning in debt, a vivacious widow with secrets, a meticulous butler guarding more than keys, and an appraiser whose expertise hides a darker intent. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a quiet spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unraveling clues, a waxy smudge, a whisper in the night, a hidden crate, leading to a cunning trap that exposes the thief's greed. In this elegant web of deception, only one truth will chime clear. Will you uncover it? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Greystone Manor. The August sun dipped low over the rolling hills of the English countryside, bathing Greystone Manor in a golden haze. The estate, with its ivy-clad stone walls and mullioned windows, stood as a testament to centuries of Winthrop family pride. Its lawns, meticulously trimmed, stretched toward a copse of ancient oaks, and the air carried the faint scent of roses from the garden. Miss Jane Marple, her white hair neatly pinned and her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, stepped from the village taxi with a small suitcase and a basket of knitting. She had been invited by her old school friend, Lady Eleanor Winthrop, to join a family reunion celebrating Eleanor's 70th birthday. The occasion promised a rare assembly of the scattered Winthrop clan, and Miss Marple, ever curious about human nature, looked forward to observing the dynamics of such a gathering. The manor's heavy oak door swung open, revealing a maid in a crisp apron who curtsied and took Miss Marple's belongings. Inside, the hall was a symphony of polished wood and ancestral portraits, their stern faces gazing down as if judging the newcomers. The hum of voices drifted from the drawing room, where the heart of the reunion pulsed. Miss Marple, after refreshing herself in a guest room adorned with chintz curtains, made her way downstairs, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the parquet floor. She wore a simple tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her appearance unassuming yet deliberate, like a sparrow blending into a hedge while watching the world unfold. The drawing room was a grand affair, its high ceiling adorned with plasterwork and its walls lined with bookshelves and gilt-framed landscapes. At its center stood the Winthrop family's most cherished possession, an 18th-century ormolu clock, its golden curves gleaming under the chandelier's light. The clock's face, adorned with delicate Roman numerals, ticked with a quiet dignity, and its chimes, soft yet resonant, marked the hours with a melody that seemed to carry the weight of generations. Miss Marple paused to admire it, noting the intricate engravings of vines and cherubs, and the way its presence seemed to anchor the room. The guests were already assembling, their voices a mix of laughter and murmured confidences. Lady Eleanor, elegant in a sapphire dress, greeted Miss Marple with a warm embrace. "Jane, how good of you to come," she said, her eyes crinkling with affection. "You must meet everyone. It's quite a crowd." Eleanor's tone was light, but Miss Marple detected a faint undercurrent of strain, as if the reunion carried burdens beyond mere festivity. First among the guests was Roger Winthrop, Eleanor's cousin, a man in his early 40s with a boyish charm that barely masked a certain restlessness. His suit was well cut but slightly rumpled, and his dark hair fell carelessly over his forehead. He lounged by the fireplace, a glass of sherry in hand, regaling a small group with a tale of a horse race gone awry. Miss Marple noted his quick glances toward the ormolu clock, as if calculating its worth rather than admiring its beauty. She recalled a young man from St. Mary Mead, a gambler who wore the same easy smile to hide his debts, and wondered what troubles Roger carried beneath his genial exterior. The butler, Mr. Graves, moved through the room with the silent efficiency of a shadow. His black suit was impeccable, his graying hair combed back, and his face betrayed no emotion save for a faint tightening of the lips when Roger's laughter grew too loud. Graves paused to adjust a silver tray of canapes, his hands steady, but his eyes darting briefly to the clock. Miss Marple, settling into a chintz armchair with her knitting, thought of the butlers she had known, men who saw everything and said little, their loyalty a double-edged sword. Mrs. Clara Hemmings, a guest and a widow of some repute, swept into the room in a cloud of perfume and silk. Her auburn hair was swept up in a fashionable chignon, and her emerald earrings caught the light as she laughed at Roger's anecdotes. She was perhaps 50, with a vivacity that seemed to demand attention, yet Miss Marple sensed a studied quality to her charm, as if each gesture were rehearsed. Clara's eyes flicked toward the clock only once, but the glance was sharp, almost possessive, before she turned to compliment Eleanor on the manor's decor. The final figure of note was Mr. Percival Lyle, an antique appraiser invited to assess the clock's value for insurance purposes. He was a lean man with a meticulous air, his pinstriped suit and polished shoes suggesting a fastidious nature. His thin mustache twitched as he spoke of provenance and craftsmanship, and his fingers, adorned with a single gold ring, adjusted his cufflinks with a nervous tick. Standing near the clock, he traced its contours with a professional eye, but Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered, not with admiration, but with something akin to hunger. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead jeweler, who had once appraised a stolen brooch, his expertise a mask for darker intentions. As the evening progressed, the guests mingled over sherry and petits fours, their conversations weaving a tapestry of familial pride and subtle tensions. Roger's jests about the clock's value, "Must be worth a king's ransom, eh, Eleanor?" drew a tight smile from his cousin. Graves, serving drinks, paused imperceptibly when the clock chimed 7, as if its sound carried a private significance. Clara Hemmings flirted lightly with Roger, her laughter a touch too bright, while Mr. Lyle excused himself to study a catalogue of antiques, his cufflinks glinting as he turned the pages. Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, watched it all. She thought of her village, where human nature played out in smaller theaters. Greed, loyalty, envy, all dressed in different costumes but always recognizable. The ormolu clock, with its golden glow and steady ticks, seemed to her a silent witness to the secrets of Greystone Manor. As the guests moved to the dining room for Eleanor's birthday feast, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her basket and followed, her mind already sifting through the threads of what promised to be a most intriguing puzzle. Chapter 2. The Clock Vanishes. The morning after Lady Eleanor Winthrop's 70th birthday celebration dawned crisp and clear, with a mist lingering over the lawns of Greystone Manor. The household, still heavy with the revelry of the previous night, stirred slowly. Breakfast was laid out in the dining room, a long mahogany table adorned with silver chafing dishes and a centerpiece of late summer roses. The scent of bacon and freshly baked scones mingled with the faint polish of the manor's ancient woodwork. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, had taken her customary walk through the rose garden, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel paths. She returned to the manor just as the first cries of alarm shattered the morning's tranquility. It was Lady Eleanor's voice, sharp and tremulous, that pierced the air. "The clock! It's gone!" The words echoed through the hall, drawing servants and guests alike to the drawing room. Miss Marple, pausing at the foot of the grand staircase, tucked her knitting into her basket and hastened toward the commotion. Her lavender cardigan fluttered slightly as she moved, her expression one of calm curiosity, though her eyes were as alert as a hawk's. The drawing room, so grand and welcoming the night before, now felt like a stage where a drama had abruptly begun. The glass case that housed the ormolu clock stood empty, its velvet lining stark against the morning light streaming through the tall windows. The lock, a delicate brass mechanism, showed no signs of tampering, no scratches, no dents, no hint of force. The absence of the clock, with its golden curves and chiming melody, left the room oddly bereft, as if its heart had been stolen. Lady Eleanor stood before the case, her sapphire dress replaced by a somber gray morning gown. Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the empty space. "It was here last night," she said, her voice breaking. "I saw it myself before we retired. 2 centuries in our family passed from father to daughter, and now—" She trailed off, her eyes brimming with tears. The gathered household, servants, family, and guests, stood in a loose semicircle, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and, in some cases, carefully veiled interest. Miss Marple, positioning herself near a velvet-upholstered chair, observed the group. Roger Winthrop, his hair still tousled from sleep, leaned against the fireplace, his usual charm replaced by a furrowed brow. He wore a hastily donned jacket over his shirt, the cuffs unbuttoned, suggesting he'd been roused abruptly. Mrs. Clara Hemmings, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, hovered near the window, her auburn hair slightly disheveled, but her composure intact. Mr. Percival Lyle, the appraiser, stood closest to the case, his pinstriped suit immaculate despite the early hour. His thin mustache twitched as he adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture Miss Marple had noted the previous evening. Mr. Graves, the butler, stood rigidly by the door, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his hands were clasped tightly behind his back. The local constable, Mr. Harris, arrived within the hour, his round face flushed from the bicycle ride from the village. He was a sturdy man in his late 30s, with a notebook clutched in one hand and a pencil stub in the other. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, betraying the haste of his summons. "Now, Lady Eleanor," he said, striving for authority, "let's have the facts. When was the clock last seen, and by whom?" Eleanor, seated now on a brocade sofa, took a deep breath. "I saw it at 11 last night, when I passed through the drawing room after the party. The case was locked, as always. Mr. Graves can confirm he secured the room before retiring." Graves nodded, his voice low and precise. "I locked the drawing room door at 11:15, sir. The key is kept in my quarters, and no one has access to it." His eyes flicked briefly to Roger, then returned to the constable, betraying nothing further. Constable Harris scribbled in his notebook. "And this morning, who discovered the theft?" "I did," said Eleanor, her voice steadier now. "I came down at 8 to arrange flowers for the breakfast table. I noticed the case was empty and, well, you can see for yourself." She gestured helplessly at the glass case, its emptiness a silent accusation. Harris approached the case, peering at the lock with an air of importance. "No signs of a break-in," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "The lock's intact. Either someone had a key, or they're a master at picking locks without a trace." He turned to the assembled group. "Did anyone see or hear anything unusual last night?" A murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke up immediately. Roger cleared his throat, stepping forward. "I was in the billiards room until well past midnight," he said, his tone defensive. "Clara, Mrs. Hemings, was with me. We were catching up." He flashed a quick smile, but it faltered under Harris's scrutiny. Mrs. Hemings nodded, her silk gown rustling as she moved closer to Roger. "Quite true," she said, her voice bright but her eyes guarded. "We were reminiscing about old times. I didn't return to my room until nearly 1. Her fingers toyed with the sash of her gown, a gesture Miss Marple found oddly deliberate. Mr. Lyle, still near the case, spoke up, his voice smooth but tinged with unease. "A theft like this is most unfortunate. The clock is a rare piece, French, 18th century, likely crafted by Jean-Pierre Latz. Its value on the open market would be considerable, though I'd wager it's destined for a private collector." He paused, adjusting his cufflinks again. An outsider, perhaps. The manor's gates were locked, but a determined thief might have scaled the wall. Miss Marple, seated now with her knitting in her lap, listened intently. Lyle's suggestion of an outsider was plausible, but his quickness to offer it struck her as calculated. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead shopkeeper, who, when accused of short-changing customers, always deflected with elaborate theories about others' misdeeds. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension in the room. Harris turned to Graves. "You're certain the room was locked? No windows forced? No other doors?" Graves inclined his head. "The windows are latched from the inside, sir. The only other entrance is through the servants' passage, which I also locked. I checked every door myself." Harris made another note, his pencil scratching loudly in the quiet room. "Right then. I'll need to speak with each of you privately, and we'll search the house, top to bottom. A clock like that doesn't just vanish." He glanced at the empty case, as if expecting the clock to reappear through sheer force of will. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her eyes scanning the room. The drawing room was a study in contrasts. The opulence of its furnishings clashed with the stark absence of the clock. She rose and approached the case, her movements unhurried. The glass was spotless, the velvet lining undisturbed except for a faint indentation where the clock had rested. She bent closer, her spectacles catching the light, and noticed a tiny smudge on the inner edge of the case, a waxy residue, barely visible. Her lips pursed slightly. The manor's electric lights made candles unnecessary, yet here was evidence of one. A thief working in the dark, perhaps, or someone who preferred not to risk the lights being seen. She straightened, her mind already turning over possibilities. The lock's pristine condition suggested access to a key, but Graves's insistence on their security was unwavering. Could a duplicate have been made? She recalled a case in her village where a locksmith's apprentice had crafted a key from a wax impression, a trick requiring skill, but not impossible for someone with expertise. Her gaze drifted to Mr. Lyle, who was now speaking quietly with Eleanor, his hands gesturing with practiced ease. His knowledge of the clock's value and its market made him a figure of interest, but she cautioned herself against hasty conclusions. Roger, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner, his earlier bravado replaced by a fidgety unease. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand. Debt, she thought, could drive a man to desperate acts, but Roger's surprise at the theft had seemed genuine. Mrs. Hemings, lingering near the window, cast occasional glances at Roger, her expression unreadable. Was it affection, complicity, or something else? Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm, each click a step in her mental sorting of the puzzle. Graves, ever the silent sentinel, began directing the maids to prepare tea, his composure a stark contrast to the household's agitation. Yet Miss Marple had seen that fleeting glance toward Roger, and she wondered what loyalties or resentments lay beneath the butler's stoic exterior. In St. Mary Mead, she had known servants who guarded their employers' secrets with fierce devotion, sometimes at great cost. Did Graves know more than he let on? Eleanor, now composed, approached Miss Marple. "Jane, this is dreadful," she said softly, her hands clasped tightly. "That clock was my father's pride. He entrusted it to me, to keep for the next generation. If it's lost—" Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple patted her hand gently. There, Eleanor," she said, her tone soothing, but her eyes sharp. "Things have a way of revealing themselves. People, you know, are not so different from village folk. They carry their motives in their gestures, their words." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that belied the keenness of her observation. As the morning wore on, Constable Harris began his interviews, starting with the servants. Miss Marple, excused for the moment, took a seat by the fireplace, her knitting a pretext for lingering. She watched as Lyle excused himself to fetch his appraisal notes, his cufflinks catching the light as he left. Roger and Mrs. Hemings exchanged a brief, whispered conversation before parting ways, their movements too casual to be entirely innocent. Graves, overseeing the maids, paused to glance at the empty case, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the clock itself. Its value was not merely monetary. It was a symbol of continuity, of trust passed down through generations. Its theft was a violation of that trust, and she sensed that the motive lay not just in greed, but in something deeper. Envy, perhaps, or a desire to wound the Winthrop legacy. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead theft, a silver teapot taken not for its value, but to settle a family grudge. The clock's disappearance felt personal, deliberate. As the household dispersed to their rooms or to assist Harris's search, Miss Marple remained, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The waxy smudge, the undisturbed lock, the alibis, each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. The thief, she thought, was among them, hidden behind a mask of surprise or indignation, and she, with her quiet ways and village wisdom, would unravel that mask before the clock's chimes were silenced forever. Chapter 3. Whispers of Motive. The late morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor's conservatory, casting dappled light on the tiled floor and the lush ferns that lined the glass walls. Miss Jane Marple sat across from Lady Eleanor Winthrop at a small wrought-iron table, a porcelain teapot steaming between them. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids, a tranquil contrast to the unrest that had settled over the household since the Ormolu clock's disappearance. Eleanor, her gray morning gown now replaced by a navy dress with a high collar, poured tea with a hand that still trembled slightly. Miss Marple, her lavender cardigan buttoned neatly, accepted a cup, her eyes soft but watchful, like a village cat observing a garden full of sparrows. "Thank you for staying, Jane," Eleanor said, her voice low, as if the conservatory's glass might carry her words to prying ears. "This theft, it's more than a loss. It's a betrayal. That clock was my father's pride, entrusted to me to keep safe for the next generation." She paused, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I can't bear the thought that someone under this roof might have taken it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of gentle sympathy, though her mind-zono was already turning over possibilities. "It is a terrible shock, Eleanor," she said softly. "But people, you know, are often less careful than they seem. Their secrets slip out in the smallest ways. A glance, a word, a moment's hesitation." She set her cup down, her knitting resting in her lap like a silent companion. "Tell me, who might have reason to take such a risk?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Roger's been pressing me to sell off some of the estate's antiques," she admitted. "He's in debt, gambling, I'm told. He's always been charming, but reckless. Last night at dinner, he made a remark about the clock's value, almost as if testing me." Her voice carried a note of reluctant suspicion, the kind born of familial loyalty strained by doubt. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faintly. She recalled Roger's casual comment about the clock's worth, delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young man much like Roger, whose charm masked a desperation for funds, though his thefts had been petty compared to this. "A man in debt can be unpredictable," she said mildly. "But he was with Mrs. Hemings, was he not? Their alibi aligns." Eleanor's eyes flickered with unease. "Clara confirmed it, yes, but she's a charming woman, Jane, but there's something about her. She's a guest, not family, invited as a favor to an old friend. Yet she seems so at ease here, so calculating. I saw her eyeing the clock last night, though she laughed it off as admiration." Miss Marple's mind turned to Mrs. Clara Hemings, whose vivacious laughter had rung out a touch too brightly during the birthday feast. She had observed Clara's fleeting glance at the clock, sharp and assessing, before it was veiled by a smile. In her village, there had been a widow with a similar knack for deflecting scrutiny with charm, her true intentions buried beneath layers of social grace. "Mrs. Hemings does have a certain presence," Miss Marple remarked, her tone neutral, but her thoughts alert. "And Mr. Lyle? His expertise makes him a natural point of interest." Eleanor sighed, setting her cup down. "Percival Lyle was recommended by a trusted dealer in London. He's valued several pieces for us before, but this time his interest in the clock seemed intense. He spoke of its rarity at length, almost as if he were cataloging it for more than just insurance purposes." She hesitated. "He mentioned private collectors, Jane, people who pay fortunes for such things, no questions asked." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. Mr. Lyle's mention of the black market had struck her as oddly specific, and his nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks suggested a man with something to hide. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead jeweler's assistant who had used his knowledge to fence stolen goods, his polished demeanor a mask for avarice. "Knowledge can be a dangerous thing," she said thoughtfully, "especially when it knows where to find a buyer." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And then there's Graves. He's been with us for 20 years, Jane. loyal to a fault. But last night, when I asked him about the drawing-room keys, he hesitated, just for a moment, but I noticed it was unlike him. He's always so precise. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. That hesitation had not escaped her notice either. Graves's stoic demeanor reminded her of a butler in her village who had once covered for a wayward nephew, his silence born of duty rather than guilt. "Loyalty can make one blind to others' faults," she said, resuming her knitting. "Or it can bind one to silence when one ought to speak." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "You think Graves knows something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that everyone in this house knows something, even if they don't realize its importance. The trick is finding the right thread to pull." She sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the morning's events. The waxy smudge on the clock's case, the undisturbed lock, the alibis. All were pieces of a puzzle that required careful assembly. The conservatory door creaked open, and a maid entered with a fresh pot of tea. Her young face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and Miss Marple. "Begging your pardon, my lady," she said, "but Constable Harris is asking for you in the library. He's questioning Mr. Winthrop now." Eleanor rose, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, Mary. Jane, will you join me later? I'd value your thoughts." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm but her mind already elsewhere. As Eleanor left, Miss Marple remained, her needles moving steadily. The maid's nervousness had not gone unnoticed. Servants often saw more than they admitted, their loyalty to the household a barrier to candor. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, housemaid, who had overheard a crucial conversation but feared speaking out. Perhaps, she mused, a quiet word with Mary later might yield something. Her thoughts returned to the suspects. Roger's debts made him an obvious candidate, but his surprise at the theft had seemed genuine, and his alibi with Mrs. Hemmings held for now. Clara's calculated charm suggested a woman adept at secrets, but her role as a guest made her motives less clear. Was she an opportunist or merely a distraction? Mr. Lyle's expertise and nervous demeanor pointed to a deeper involvement, his knowledge of the black market a potential clue to his intentions. And Graves, his hesitation over the keys, hinted at knowledge he was unwilling to share, perhaps out of loyalty or fear. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow but purposeful. She crossed to the conservatory's windows, gazing out at the manicured lawns. The clock's theft was not a random act. It was deliberate, personal, aimed at striking at the heart of the Winthrop legacy. She recalled a village theft years ago, where a family heirloom was stolen not for profit, but to wound a rival. The Ormolu clock, with its golden elegance and historical weight, was more than an object. It was a symbol, and its theft was a message. She resolved to observe each suspect more closely, to listen for the unguarded word, the fleeting glance that would betray their truth. Roger's restlessness, Clara's artifice, Lyle's nerves, Graves's reticence, each was a thread in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, was the key to the clock's whereabouts. As she returned to her seat, picking up her knitting, Miss Marple's mind was a quiet whirl of connections. The conservatory's peace belied the storm brewing within Greystone Manor, but she was no stranger to storms. In St. Mary Mead, she had weathered many, unraveling secrets with the patience of her knitting needles. Here, in this grand old house, she would do the same. One careful stitch at a time. Chapter 4. The Cousin's Alibi. The library at Greystone Manor was a sanctuary of dark oak shelves and leather-bound volumes, its air thick with the scent of aged paper and beeswax polish. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls, where portraits of stern Winthrop ancestors seemed to watch the proceedings with disapproval. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket tucked under her arm, entered quietly, her presence almost unnoticed amidst the morning's tension. Constable Harris had commandeered the room for his interviews, and Roger Winthrop, Lady Eleanor's cousin, was the first to face scrutiny. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair near a window, her lavender cardigan blending into the room's muted tones, her needles clicking softly as she observed. Roger lounged in a leather armchair opposite Harris, his posture deliberately casual, though his fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the armrest. His disheveled suit, now tidied but still bearing the creases of a late night, suggested a man unaccustomed to early mornings. His dark hair fell over his forehead, and his smile, though charming, carried a hint of strain. Harris, his notebook open and pencil poised, fixed Roger with a steady gaze. "Mr. Winthrop," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of officialdom, "you claim you were in the billiards room last night until past midnight. Can you be more precise?" Roger's smile widened, but his eyes flickered toward the window, where Miss Marple sat, her needles moving with metronomic precision. "I'd say until about 1, Constable," he replied, his tone light. "Mrs. Hemings, Clara, was with me. We were having a bit of a laugh, playing a few rounds, sharing a bottle of champagne. You know how these reunions go." He waved a hand, as if dismissing the theft as a minor inconvenience. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, a gambler like Roger, whose easy manner had masked a penchant for half-truths. Roger's alibi depended on Mrs. Hemings, and while their story aligned, the vagueness of the timing struck her as convenient. She tilted her head slightly, her spectacles catching the firelight. "Mr. Winthrop," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "you mentioned the clock's value at dinner last night. Quite a sum, you said. It must have been on your mind." Roger's smile faltered, and he shifted in his chair, his fingers stilling on the armrest. "Just idle talk, Miss Marple," he said, a touch too quickly. "You know how it is. Family heirlooms, always a topic of conversation. I didn't mean anything by it." His eyes met hers, then darted away, settling on the constable's notebook. Harris scribbled a note, his pencil scratching loudly in the quiet room. "Idle talk or not, Mr. Winthrop, you've got debts, haven't you? Word is you're in deep with some London bookmakers. A clock like that could clear a slate, couldn't it?" Roger's face flushed, and he leaned forward, his charm giving way to indignation. "Now see here, Constable, I wouldn't touch that clock. It's Eleanor's pride and joy. Besides, I was with Clara all evening. Ask her. She'll tell you the same." He sat back, crossing his arms, but his foot tapped nervously against the floor. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Roger's defensiveness was telling, but his surprise at the theft had seemed genuine in the drawing room that morning. A man desperate for funds might steal, she thought, but Roger's reliance on Mrs. Hemings's corroboration suggested either truth or collusion. She made a mental note to speak with Clara next, to test the strength of their shared alibi. In her village, she had once unraveled a theft by catching a pair of conspirators in a lie about their whereabouts, their stories too perfectly aligned to be natural. Harris flipped a page in his notebook. "Right then. Did you see anyone near the drawing room last night? Anyone acting odd?" Roger shook his head, his expression earnest. "Not a soul. The party was in full swing. People were in the dining room, the terrace, the billiards room. I didn't go near the drawing room after dinner." He paused, then added, "Though I did see Lyle hovering about earlier. He was awfully keen on that clock, going on about its craftsmanship. Bit obsessive, if you ask me." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Roger's quickness to point a finger at Mr. Lyle was interesting, though not unexpected. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen guilty parties deflect suspicion by casting it on others, but Roger's tone lacked the slyness of calculation. It was more like the petulance of a man cornered. She glanced at Harris, who was jotting down Roger's words, his brow furrowed with concentration. "And the butler, Mr. Graves?" Harris pressed. "He says he locked the drawing room at 11:15. You didn't see him about later?" Roger shrugged. "Graves is always skulking around, isn't he? Part of his job. I didn't notice him after the party wound down, but if he says he locked the room, I'd believe him. He's been here forever, practically part of the furniture." His laugh was forced, and he glanced at Miss Marple again, as if seeking her reaction. She offered a small, encouraging smile, her eyes never leaving his face. Roger's casual dismissal of Graves was too glib, she thought, and she recalled the butler's hesitation when questioned about the keys. Loyalty could make a servant complicit, she mused, or it could make them a target for blame. Her mind flickered to the waxy smudge on the clock's case, a detail she had not yet shared with Harris. It suggested a thief working in darkness, but Roger's alibi placed him elsewhere. Or did it? Harris closed his notebook with a snap. "That'll do for now, Mr. Winthrop. Don't leave the manor without informing me. We'll be searching the grounds and your rooms later today." Roger stood, smoothing his jacket. "Search away, Constable. I've nothing to hide." His tone was defiant, but his quick exit betrayed a nervousness that lingered in the air like smoke. As he passed Miss Marple, he nodded curtly, his eyes avoiding hers. The library door closed behind him, and Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "A slippery one, that Mr. Winthrop," he muttered. "Debt's up to his ears, and that alibi's only as good as Mrs. Hemmings's word." He glanced at Miss Marple, as if suddenly remembering her presence. "You've been quiet, Miss Marple. Any thoughts?" She folded her knitting carefully, her movements deliberate. "Oh, I'm just an old woman, Constable, with too much time to think," she said, her voice mild, but her eyes twinkling. "But I've found that alibis, like stories, are only as strong as their weakest link. Mr. Winthrop seems certain of his evening, but certainty can be a mask, don't you think?" Harris frowned, clearly unsure how to take her words. "You think he's lying?" "I think," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair, "that people often tell the truth they wish to believe. I should like to speak with Mrs. Hemmings next, if you don't mind. A woman's perspective can be so illuminating." She smiled, and Harris, slightly bemused, nodded his agreement. As she left the library, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the morning's observations. Roger's alibi hinged on Clara, but his nervousness suggested he was hiding something. Perhaps not the theft itself, but a related indiscretion. His mention of Lyle was a deflection, but it aligned with her own suspicions about the appraiser's keen interest in the clock. And Graves, with his steadfast loyalty, remained an enigma. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Grocer, who had once sworn to an alibi for his son, only to crumble when the details were pressed. Roger's story, she decided, needed testing, and Clara Hemmings was the key. The manor's halls were quiet now, the guests and servants scattered as Harris's search began. Miss Marple paused by a window overlooking the rose garden, her thoughts returning to the clock. Its theft was no impulsive act. It required planning, access, and a motive deeper than mere profit. Roger's debts made him a suspect, but his behavior suggested a man more flustered than guilty. She would speak with Clara, probe the edges of their alibi, and watch for the small betrayals of truth that always surfaced, like ripples in a village pond. Her needles, tucked into her basket, seemed to wait patiently for the next thread in the tapestry of Greystone Manor's secrets. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and moved toward the rose garden, where she knew Clara Hemmings liked to linger, her mind as sharp as the thorns she passed. Chapter 5. The Guest's Tale. The rose garden at Greystone Manor was a haven of order amidst the morning's disarray, its neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant blooms exuding a quiet elegance. The gravel paths crunched softly underfoot as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Mrs. Clara Hemmings, who stood near a trellis heavy with crimson roses. Clara's silk scarf, a vivid shade of emerald, fluttered in the light breeze, and her auburn hair caught the sunlight, giving her an almost theatrical glow. She was pruning a stray leaf with a pair of small shears, her movements precise, but her expression distant, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple, her lavender cardigan blending with the garden's softer hues, approached with a gentle smile, her knitting basket tucked under her arm like a faithful companion. "Good morning, Mrs. Hemmings," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the petals around them. "Such a lovely spot, isn't it? Though I dare say the events of the morning cast a shadow over even these roses." Clara turned, her smile quick but not entirely warm, like a curtain drawn back to reveal a stage still being set. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're quite right," she said, her voice carrying the practiced lilt of a seasoned conversationalist. "It's dreadful about the clock. Poor Eleanor is beside herself." She snipped another leaf, the shears clicking sharply, and placed it in a small basket at her feet. Miss Marple nodded, settling onto a nearby bench, her knitting emerging from her basket with the ease of habit. "Indeed, a terrible loss. I understand you were with Mr. Winthrop last night, in the billiards room. It must have been a lively evening." Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, watched Clara closely. Clara's fingers paused on the shears just for a moment before she resumed her task. "Oh yes, quite lively," she said, her laugh bright but brittle, like glass catching the light. "Roger and I were reminiscing. Old friends, you know. A bit of champagne, a few games of billiards. We lost track of time, I'm afraid. It was nearly 1 when I retired." She glanced at Miss Marple, her green eyes assessing, as if gauging how much to reveal. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a rhythmic counterpoint to the garden's quiet. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, widow, Mrs. Price, whose charm had masked a penchant for bending the truth, her alibis always polished but fraying under scrutiny. "Nearly 1," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Such a late hour. You must have been among the last to leave the party. Did you happen to pass the drawing room on your way to bed?" Clara's smile tightened, and she set the shears down, brushing her hands together as if to dismiss the question. The drawing room? No, I don't believe so. I took the main staircase from the billiards room. It's a bit of a maze, this house, but I kept to the well-lit paths. She laughed again, but it was a touch too high, and her fingers toyed with the edge of her scarf, twisting it slightly. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but unyielding. "Of course," she said kindly. "Though, it's curious, isn't it, how a house like this holds its secrets. I remember a case in my village, a stolen brooch, of all things. The thief swore they'd never been near the room, but a dropped hairpin gave them away. Small things, Mrs. Hemings, can be so telling." Clara's eyes flickered, and for a moment her composure seemed to waver, like a breeze rippling a still pond. "A hairpin," she said, her tone light but forced. "How quaint. But I assure you, Miss Marple, I was nowhere near the drawing room. Roger and I were quite occupied." She turned back to the roses, her movements brisk now, as if eager to shift the conversation. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind cataloguing every nuance. Clara's insistence on her alibi was firm, but the vagueness of her timing. "Nearly one," echoed Roger's own imprecision. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft by noting how a pair's stories, though aligned, lacked the natural inconsistencies of truth. Clara's guarded glances and the nervous twist of her scarf suggested she was hiding something, but whether it was the theft or a lesser indiscretion remained unclear. "And such a lovely evening it must have been," Miss Marple continued, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Champagne and billiards do make for a merry time. Did anyone else join you, perhaps? Or was it just you and Mr. Winthrop, lost in your reminiscences?" Clara hesitated, her shears hovering over a rosebud. "Just us," she said, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "The others were scattered about, dancing, chatting on the terrace. You know how these gatherings are. People come and go." She snipped the rosebud with a decisive click and dropped it into her basket, her movements almost too deliberate. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her thoughts turning to the billiards room. It was on the opposite side of the manor from the drawing room, a fact that supported Clara's alibi, but also made it difficult to verify. She recalled the waxy smudge on the clock's case, a clue that pointed to a nighttime theft, likely after the household had retired. If Clara and Roger had been together until 1, their alibi held, unless they were colluding. But Clara's unease, her quick deflections, suggested a secret beyond the theft, perhaps one tied to Roger's restless demeanor. "You must be fond of Greystone," Miss Marple said, changing tack. "To be invited as a guest to such a family affair is quite an honor. I understand you're a friend of a friend, so to speak?" Clara's smile returned, more confident now. "Yes, a mutual acquaintance of Eleanor's. I've always admired this place, its history, its treasures." Her eyes flickered briefly, and Miss Marple caught a trace of something, ambition, perhaps, or envy, in her expression. The clock, for instance, such a magnificent piece. I remarked on it to Eleanor last night. A pity it's gone. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Clara's mention of the clock was unsolicited, a detail offered too readily, like a St. Mary Mead shopgirl who had once over-explained her innocence in a theft. "A pity, indeed," Miss Marple said. "It's curious, don't you think, how such a valuable item could vanish without a trace? Almost as if someone knew exactly how to take it." Clara's fingers tightened on her scarf, and she turned to face Miss Marple fully, her smile now a touch strained. "I'm sure the constable will sort it out," she said. "These things have a way of turning up, don't they?" She glanced toward the manor as if eager to escape. "I should check on Eleanor. She'll need all the support she can get." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as ever. "Do give her my regards." As Clara walked away, her scarf trailing like a flag of retreat, Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the hurried pace of her steps. Clara Hemmings was a puzzle, she thought, her charm a polished surface that concealed something murkier. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the discomfort of a woman caught in a web of her own making? Miss Marple rose from the bench, her knitting tucked back into her basket. The rose garden, with its orderly beauty, seemed a fitting place for such a conversation, its thorns hidden beneath vibrant blooms, much like the secrets hidden beneath Clara's vivacity. She thought of the clock, its golden curves now absent, and the waxy smudge that hinted at a thief's careful work. Clara's alibi, tied to Roger's, was a thread in the tapestry, but its edges were fraying under scrutiny. As she made her way back to the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects. Roger's debts and nervous defiance pointed to a man under pressure, but his reliance on Clara suggested a shared secret, perhaps unrelated to the theft. Mr. Lyle's expertise and nervous tics made him a compelling figure, his knowledge of the black market a potential motive. And Mr. Graves, with his stoic loyalty and that fleeting hesitation over the keys, remained a quiet enigma, like a village servant she had once known who shielded a family's shame out of duty. The manor loomed ahead, its stone façade unyielding, its secrets locked within. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her mind as sharp as the gravel beneath her feet. Clara Hemmings had given her much to ponder, but the truth, she knew, lay in the small inconsistencies, the unguarded moments that revealed more than words. She would speak with Graves next, she decided, to test the strength of his loyalty and the weight of his silence. The ormolu clock, with its silent chimes, was calling her to unravel its mystery, and Miss Marple, with her village wisdom and quiet persistence, was ready to answer. Chapter 6. The Butler's Secret. The pantry at Greystone Manor was a small, orderly realm, its shelves lined with gleaming silver and neatly stacked china, the air tinged with the faint scent of lemon polish and old wood. Mr. Graves, the butler, stood at a long oak table, his black suit as impeccable as ever, his graying hair combed back with precision. He was polishing a silver candelabrum with a soft cloth, his movements deliberate, almost meditative, as if the task anchored him amidst the morning's upheaval. The theft of the ormolu clock had cast a pall over the household, and the pantry, tucked away from the manor's grander spaces, seemed a fitting place for a quiet conversation. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting basket in hand, entered with a gentle knock, her lavender cardigan and sensible shoes blending into the room's muted tones like a shadow passing unnoticed. "Good morning, Mr. Graves," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying the warmth of a village neighbor. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Such a trying day, isn't it?" She settled onto a wooden stool near the table, her knitting emerging from her basket with the ease of long habit. Graves paused, his cloth stilling on the candelabrum's intricate curves. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he replied, his tone measured, his face a mask of professional courtesy. "Indeed, a troubling matter. The loss of the clock is a blow to her ladyship." His eyes, a pale gray, met hers briefly before returning to his task, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, like a cloud passing over a calm sky. She nodded, her needles clicking softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pantry's stillness. "A blow, indeed," she said. "The clock is more than an heirloom, I gather, a symbol of trust, passed down through generations. You've been with the family many years, Mr. Graves. You must feel its absence keenly." Graves's hands resumed their polishing, but his movements were slightly less fluid now, as if her words had stirred something beneath his stoic exterior. "20 years, madam," he said. "I served the late Lord Winthrop, and now Lady Eleanor. The clock was his pride. I ensured its case was polished weekly, the key secure." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, a detail as telling as a dropped stitch in her knitting. She tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light from a small window above. "And you locked the drawing-room last night, at 11:15, I believe you told the constable. Such precision is admirable. The keys, you said, are kept in your quarters?" Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the smallest betrayal of truth. Graves's cloth faltered, and the candelabrum clinked softly against the table. He recovered quickly, setting it down with care. "Yes, madam," he said, his voice as even as ever. "The keys are in a locked box in my room, only I have access. The drawing-room was secure when I checked it last night, and the windows were latched." He clasped his hands behind his back, standing a little, straighter, as if to reinforce his certainty. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her expression one of mild interest. She thought of a butler in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Jenkins, who had once shielded a young footman's theft out of misplaced loyalty, his hesitation over small details betraying his conflict. Graves's pause, brief though it was, echoed that moment. "Of course," she said kindly. "Keys are such important things, aren't they? In my village we had a case once, a stolen locket taken from a locked drawer. The key, it turned out, had been borrowed, quite innocently, by someone trusted. Loyalty can make one overlook such things." Graves's eyes flickered again, and for a moment his hands tightened behind his back. "No one borrowed the keys, Miss Marple," he said firmly. "I keep them secure. If someone entered the drawing-room, they did so by other means." His tone was resolute, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tremor, like a note held too long in a village choir. She smiled, her needles moving steadily. "Naturally, Mr. Graves, you're a man of duty. But it's curious, isn't it, how a lock can remain untouched yet a treasure vanish? I noticed a waxy smudge on the clock's case this morning. Such a small thing, but it made me think of candles. The manor has electric lights, of course, but a thief might need light in the dark, don't you think?" Graves's face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to adjust something, a tie, a cuff, a secret. "A smudge, madam?" he said, his voice neutral. "Perhaps from the polishing. The maids are thorough, but mistakes happen." He picked up the candelabrum again, his movements deliberate, as if to close the subject. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The smudge was no accident, she thought, and Graves's quick dismissal only deepened her curiosity. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft by noting a servant's overeager explanation for a misplaced item. Graves's loyalty to the Winthrops was clear, but was it to the family as a whole, or to one member in particular? She recalled his fleeting glance at Roger Winthrop in the drawing-room, a look that held more than professional detachment. "You must see so much, Mr. Graves," she said, her tone as warm as a fireside chat. "Servants often do, in houses like this. In my village, our butler, Mr. Jenkins, knew every secret of the manor, though he'd never speak of them. But sometimes a word or two slips out, especially when trust is at stake." Graves set the candelabrum down, his hands now clasped tightly before him. "I see what is necessary, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "My duty is to Lady Eleanor and the household. I saw nothing unusual last night, beyond the usual comings and goings of a party." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Winthrop and Mrs. Hemmings were in the billiards room, as they said. Mr. Lyle was about earlier, examining the clock. I ensured he left the drawing-room before I locked it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his. His mention of Lyle was unsolicited, much like Roger's earlier deflection, and it struck her as a careful nudge. Was Graves protecting someone, or simply pointing out what he thought relevant? She thought of the waxy smudge again, and the undisturbed lock, which pointed to a key, or a clever imitation. Graves's insistence on the key's security was firm, but his hesitation suggested a crack in his armor. "Thank you, Mr. Graves," she said, folding her knitting with care. "You've been most helpful. A house like this depends on men like you, doesn't it? Though I dare say it carries its burdens." She rose, her smile as gentle as ever, but her mind was racing, piecing together the threads of the morning's conversations. As she left the pantry, Graves resumed his polishing, his movements mechanical now, his face unreadable. Miss Marple stepped into the hall, the manor's cool stone walls a contrast to the pantry's warmth. Graves's loyalty was a fortress, she thought, but even fortresses had hidden gates. His hesitation over the keys, his quick mention of Lyle, and his guarded demeanor suggested he. Chapter 7. The Appraiser's Expertise. The study at Greystone Manor was a quiet enclave, its walls lined with dark walnut paneling and shelves of leather-bound books that exuded the musty authority of old knowledge. A single window, framed by heavy velvet curtains, let in a shaft of midday light, illuminating a mahogany desk cluttered with papers and a brass inkstand. Mr. Percival Lyle, the antique appraiser, stood near a side table, his lean frame bent over a set of porcelain vases, his fingers tracing their delicate patterns with a professional's reverence. His pinstriped suit was immaculate, his thin mustache neatly trimmed, but his nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks betrayed an undercurrent of unease. Miss Jane Marple, entering with her knitting basket tucked under her arm, offered a gentle smile, her lavender cardigan and sensible shoes rendering her as unassuming as a village spinster, though her eyes gleamed with quiet acuity. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lyle," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of the curtains. "I see you're admiring the vases, such lovely pieces. You must find Greystone a treasure trove for your expertise." She settled into a leather armchair, her knitting emerging with the ease of habit, the needles clicking like a metronome, measuring the room's tension. Lyle straightened, his cufflinks glinting as he turned to face her. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone polished but tinged with caution. "Indeed, the manor is a collector's dream. These vases, early Meissen, I'd wager, are quite fine, though nothing compared to that ormolu clock." His lips twitched into a smile, but his eyes darted briefly to the door, as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple's needles, moved steadily, her expression one of mild curiosity. "A tragedy. Its loss," she said. "Such a rare piece, as you noted at dinner. You seemed quite taken with it, its craftsmanship, its history. I suppose an appraiser like yourself knows exactly what such a clock might fetch." Lyle's smile tightened, and he adjusted his cufflinks again, the gesture almost reflexive. "Oh, it's priceless to the Winthrops, of course," he said, his voice smooth but deliberate. "But on the open market, a Lott's clock of that period could command tens of thousands, more, perhaps, to the right buyer." He paused, then added, "Not that I'd know from experience. My work is strictly above board, valuations, insurance, that sort of thing." Miss Marple tilted her head, her spectacles catching the light. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead, jeweler's assistant, Mr. Tompkins, whose expertise in gems had led him to dabble in less reputable markets, his polished demeanor a mask for greed. Lyle's quick disclaimer reminded her of Tompkins' protests of innocence, offered before anyone had accused him. "Of course," she said kindly. "Though you did mention private collectors last night, didn't you? People who might pay handsomely, no questions asked. It's fascinating how such markets work." Lyle's fingers froze on his cufflinks, and for a moment his composure wavered, like a curtain stirred by a sudden draft. "A figure of speech, Miss Marple," he said, recovering with a laugh that sounded forced. "The black market is a shadowy place, collectors with deep pockets but little scruples. I only meant to illustrate the clock's value." He moved to the desk, picking up a notebook filled with neat handwriting, as if to anchor himself in his professional role. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind sifting through his words. His knowledge of the black market was specific, too specific for mere conjecture, and his nervous tics suggested a man under pressure. She recalled the waxy smudge on the clock's case, a clue that pointed to a nighttime theft, and wondered if Lyle's expertise extended to locks as well as antiques. In her village, she had once caught a thief by noting his familiarity with a safe's mechanism, a skill he'd claimed was purely academic. "It must be a challenge," she said, her tone conversational, "to appraise something as intricate as that clock. Did you examine its lock closely? Such a delicate mechanism, I imagine." Lyle's eyes flickered, and he set the notebook down with a touch too much force. "The lock? Oh, standard for its time," he said, his voice brisk. "A simple brass pin tumbler, nothing remarkable. I was more interested in the clock's movement. French, exquisite work." He adjusted his cufflinks again, the glint of gold catching Miss Marple's eye. She nodded, her smile as gentle as ever. "Of course, though a lock like that, undisturbed as it was, suggests someone with a key or a clever way of bypassing it. In my village, we had a case once, a stolen silver tray taken from a locked cabinet. The thief had made a wax impression of the key, you see. Quite ingenious." Her tone was light, almost admiring, but her eyes watched Lyle closely, noting the slight tightening of his lips. "Wax impressions are old tricks," Lyle said, his laugh a shade too loud. "Hardly necessary when keys are so easily misplaced in a house this size, but I wouldn't know about such things. My job is to value, not to pilfer." He moved to the vases again, his fingers tracing their rims with exaggerated care, as if to distance himself from the conversation. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the waxy smudge she had found. Lyle's dismissal of wax impressions was quick, but his knowledge of them was telling. She thought of the undisturbed lock, the candlelit theft, and Lyle's evident familiarity with the clock's mechanism. His expertise made him a natural suspect, but his nervousness suggested more than simple greed, perhaps fear of discovery, or a plan already in motion. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that those who protested their innocence most loudly often had the most to hide. "You must see such fascinating pieces in your work," she said, changing tack. "Do you often deal with private collectors? I imagine they'd be eager for something as rare as the Winthrop clock." Her voice was as warm as a village tea party, but her question was a probe, testing the edges of Lyle's composure. He hesitated, his fingers lingering on a vase. "Occasionally," he said, his tone cautious. "Collectors are a peculiar lot, some legitimate, some less so. But I keep to reputable clients. Lady Eleanor hired me for insurance purposes, nothing more." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing the trap beneath her gentle demeanor. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Naturally," she said. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how such a valuable item could vanish so cleanly? Almost as if someone knew its worth and its vulnerabilities intimately." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, then added, "I do hope Constable Harris finds it soon. It would be a shame for such a treasure to be lost to shadowy hands." Lyle's cufflinks glinted as he adjusted them yet again, his smile now a thin line. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "A shame. If you'll excuse me, I must review my notes for the constable." He gathered his notebook and moved toward the door, his steps brisk, as if eager to escape her scrutiny. As he left, Miss Marple remained in the study, her knitting a quiet companion to her thoughts. Lyle's expertise was undeniable, but his nervous tics and quick deflections painted a picture of a man with something to conceal. His mention of the black market, his familiarity with the clock's lock, and his unease at her probing suggested a deeper involvement. She recalled the waxy smudge, the undisturbed lock, and the precision required to steal such a piece without a trace. Lyle's knowledge made him a compelling suspect, but she cautioned herself against haste. Motives, like village gossip, could be misleading without evidence. Her thoughts turned to the other suspects. Roger Winthrop's debts and vague alibi with Clara Hemmings hinted at desperation, but his surprise at the theft seemed genuine. Clara's calculated charm and evasive answers suggested a secret, though whether it was theft or something more personal remained unclear. Mr. Graves, with his stoic loyalty and that telling hesitation over the keys, was a puzzle yet to be solved. Each was a thread in the tapestry, but Lyle's expertise and nervous demeanor made him a thread that tugged at her attention. Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her basket. The study's quiet elegance seemed to hold the manor's secrets, much like the clock had held its history. She thought of the waxy smudge again, and the possibility of a wax impression, a trick that required skill and opportunity, both of which Lyle possessed. As she stepped into the hall, her mind was already planning her next move, a closer look at the drawing room to search for further clues that might confirm or unravel her suspicions. The ormolu clock, with its silent chimes, was calling her to its mystery, and Miss Marple, with her village wisdom and patient observation, was determined to answer. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Dust. The drawing room at Greystone Manor, stripped of its ormolu clock, felt like a stage missing its star performer. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, glinting off the polished oak floor and the glass case that stood empty, its velvet lining a mute testament to the theft. Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting basket tucked under her arm, entered the room with Constable Harris's permission, her lavender cardigan and sensible shoes rendering her as unremarkable as a shadow. The household was still abuzz with the morning's shock, but the drawing room was quiet now, the guests and servants occupied elsewhere, as Harris's search of the manor continued. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the room. With the quiet precision of a village spinster, accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. She approached the glass case, its brass lock gleaming under the chandelier's light, untouched by any visible sign of force. The velvet within was pristine, save for the faint indentation where the clock had rested, a ghostly outline of its absence. Miss Marple bent closer, her movements slow and deliberate, as if not to disturb the air itself. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of knitting, hovered near the case's inner edge, where she had noticed the waxy smudge that morning. It was still there, a faint smear, barely discernible against the glass, a residue of candle, wax, she was certain, though the manor's electric lights made such a tool unnecessary. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft as a whisper in a village church. She straightened, her mind turning over the implications. A thief working by candlelight suggested caution, perhaps to avoid detection by the household's electric glow. But it also hinted at premeditation, a plan executed in the small hours when the manor slept. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a theft, a silver teapot taken from a vicarage, by noting a similar clue. A drop of wax on a windowsill, left by a thief who preferred darkness to discretion. The smudge here was no accident, she thought, but a breadcrumb in the trail of the clock's disappearance. Her gaze shifted to the surrounding furniture, the heavy mahogany tables and brocade chairs that filled the room with stately elegance. Near the case, a small side table caught her attention, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen, but marred by a faint disturbance in the dust. It was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but Miss Marple's years of observing village households had honed her senses. The dust, barely settled, was smudged in a circular pattern, as if something heavy had been set down briefly and then removed. She bent closer, her spectacles catching the light, and estimated the mark's size, roughly the diameter of the clock's base, though she cautioned herself against leaping to conclusions. "Something rested here," she said to herself, her voice barely audible. Something moved in haste, perhaps. She thought of the clock, its weight and bulk requiring careful handling, and wondered if the thief had paused here, perhaps to adjust their grip or to listen for approaching footsteps. The mark was fresh, likely from the night before, and its proximity to the case suggested a direct connection to the theft. Miss Marple stepped back, her knitting basket swinging gently at her side, and surveyed the room anew. The windows, latched as Mr. Graves had claimed, showed no signs of tampering, their heavy curtains undisturbed. The door, with its sturdy lock, bore no scratches or dents. The thief, she reasoned, had either possessed a key or crafted a means to bypass the lock without leaving a trace. She recalled Mr. Lyle's casual mention of the lock's simplicity, his knowledge of its mechanism, a potential clue, and the waxy smudge that aligned with her suspicion of a wax impression. In her village, a locksmith's apprentice had once used such a trick, his skill turning a trusted position into a tool for theft. She moved to the fireplace, its marble mantel adorned with porcelain figurines and a silver carriage clock, a lesser cousin to the stolen ormolu. The hearth was cold, the ashes swept clean, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a small brass poker leaning against the grate. It was slightly askew, its polished surface catching the light at an odd angle, as if it had been handled recently and not returned to its precise place. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool metal, and noted a faint smudge on its handle. Grease, perhaps, or oil, too subtle for a servant's cleaning cloth, but enough to suggest use. "Interesting," she murmured, her mind filing the detail away. The room's silence was broken by the creak of the door, and Constable Harris entered, his notebook clutched in one hand, his round face flushed from his rounds. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation. "You're still here? I thought you'd be taking tea with Lady Eleanor by now." Miss Marple smiled, her needles emerging from her basket as she settled into a chair. "Oh, I find rooms like this so telling, Constable," she said, her voice as gentle as a village breeze. "They hold their secrets, you know, in the smallest things. A smudge, a misplaced object. Have you noticed the dust on that table?" She nodded toward the side table, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Harris frowned, crossing to the table and peering at it with a skeptical squint. "Dust? Looks clean to me," he said, rubbing a finger across the surface. "The maids here are thorough." "Indeed they are," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking softly. "But look closer, Constable. A faint circle, as if something heavy rested there briefly. And the waxy smudge on the case. Candle wax, I'd wager. It's curious, don't you think? In a house with electric lights?" Harris's brow furrowed deeper, and he bent closer to the table, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Wax, you say?" he muttered, then straightened, scribbling in his notebook. "Could be nothing, but I'll have it noted. You've got a sharp eye, Miss Marple. Anything else catch your fancy?" She tilted her head, her smile as warm as ever. "Only a feeling, Constable. In my village we had a theft once, a silver tray, taken from a locked room. The thief left a smudge of oil on a door handle, you see, from a tool they'd used. Small things, but they add up." She paused, her needles pausing too, as if to emphasize her point. "The poker by the fireplace, for instance. It's slightly askew, and there's a smudge on its handle. Not much, but enough to make one wonder." Harris crossed to the fireplace, his boots heavy on the oak floor, and examined the poker with a grunt. "Could be the maids, careless-like," he said, but his tone was less certain now. He made another note, then turned to her. "You're full of ideas, Miss Marple. Makes me think I ought to keep you on as an assistant." He chuckled, but his eyes held a glimmer of respect. Miss Marple's laugh was soft, like a ripple in a village pond. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time to think," she said, her needles resuming their rhythm. "But rooms like this, Constable, they speak if you listen. The clock's thief was careful, but not careful enough." As Harris left to continue his search, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a quiet companion to her thoughts. The waxy smudge, the disturbed dust, the smudged poker, all were threads in a tapestry that pointed to a deliberate act. Mr. Lyle's expertise and nervous tics made him a compelling suspect, his knowledge of the lock and the black market aligning with the clues. Yet Roger Winthrop's debts and vague alibi with Clara Hemmings suggested a man under pressure, while Clara's calculated charm hinted at secrets of her own. Mr. Graves, with his stoic loyalty and hesitation over the keys, remained a quiet puzzle, his silence perhaps shielding someone. Or something. Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her basket. The drawing room, with its empty case and silent clues, was a stage where the thief had played their part, but they had left their marks, however faint. She thought of the clock, its golden chimes silenced, and resolved to pursue the threads further. Lyle's expertise, the wax, the dust, all pointed to a plan executed with precision. But human nature, as she knew from St. Mary Mead, was never flawless. The truth, she felt, was close, waiting in the shadows for her to coax it into the light. Chapter 9. A Nighttime Revelation. The moon hung low over Greystone Manor, casting a silver glow through the tall windows of the grand hall, where shadows danced across the polished oak floor. The household had settled into an uneasy quiet, the day's upheaval over the stolen ormolu clock giving way to the stillness of night. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not one to retire early when a puzzle beckoned. Clad in her lavender cardigan, her knitting basket left behind in her room, she lingered in the hall, ostensibly reading a volume of poetry borrowed from the library. Her spectacles glinted faintly as she turned a page, but her attention was on the manor's nocturnal stirrings, her ears attuned to the soft creaks and murmurs of a house that never truly slept. She had chosen her position carefully, a high-backed chair near a corner, partially obscured by a potted fern, offering a clear view of the corridor leading to the billiards room and the main staircase. The hall was dimly lit, a single electric lamp casting a warm pool of light, but Miss Marple's village instincts told her that secrets often emerged in the dark. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a scandal by overhearing a whispered conversation in a vicarage garden at midnight, and she sensed that Greystone held similar revelations, waiting for a patient observer. At precisely 10 minutes to midnight, a soft tread broke the silence. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite the hour, caught a flicker of movement. Mrs. Clara Hemmings, her silk dressing gown a whisper of emerald in the shadows, glided toward the billiards room. Her auburn hair was loosely pinned, and her steps were cautious, as if mindful of being heard. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her book lowering to her lap. Clara's alibi with Roger Winthrop had been firm but vague, and her calculated charm in the rose garden had left Miss Marple curious about what lay beneath her polished exterior. Moments later, another figure emerged. Roger Winthrop, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his footsteps heavier but equally stealthy. He glanced about the hall, his eyes passing over Miss Marple's shadowed corner, and followed Clara into the billiards room. The door closed softly behind him, but not before Miss Marple caught the faint click of a latch. She set her book aside, her movements slow and silent, and crept closer, her sensible shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. Positioning herself near the door, she pressed her ear to the wood, her village instincts guiding her as surely as they had in St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes. Voices, low and urgent, filtered through the door. "You promised to keep quiet," Roger hissed, his tone sharp with frustration. "This wasn't supposed to come up. Not now. Not here." Clara's reply was softer, almost pleading, but carried a steely edge. "I've kept my word, Roger, but you can't expect me to lie forever. It wasn't about the clock, you know that." Her voice dipped, too low for Miss Marple to catch the rest, but the words were enough to set her mind racing. She retreated to her chair, her heart beating a little faster, though her expression remained serene. The exchange was cryptic, but it confirmed her suspicion that Roger and Clara shared a secret, one that weighed heavily on them both. The mention of the clock, or rather its dismissal, suggested their secret was separate from the theft, perhaps a personal indiscretion that complicated their alibi. In St. Mary Mead, she had once overheard a similar conversation between a maid and a tradesman, their whispers revealing an affair that had nothing to do with the stolen goods but muddied the waters of the investigation. Was Clara protecting Roger or herself? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the clock's theft, the waxy smudge, and the disturbed dust in the drawing room. Roger and Clara's late-night meeting cast doubt on their billiards room alibi, but it also pointed to a distraction, a side plot that might obscure the true thief's actions. She considered Mr. Lyle, whose expertise and nervous tics made him a compelling suspect, and Mr. Graves, whose hesitation over the keys hinted at a loyalty stretched thin. The billiards room, far from the drawing room, offered a convenient alibi for Roger and Clara, but their secrecy suggested they were hiding something else, perhaps a liaison or a scheme unrelated to the clock. She rose, her movements as quiet as a village mouse, and returned to her room, the poetry book tucked under her arm. The hall was silent now, the billiards room door closed, but the echo of Roger and Clara's words lingered in her mind. She thought of the waxy smudge, the undisturbed lock, and the faint circle in the dust, clues that pointed to a careful thief, someone with access, skill, and motive. Lyle's knowledge of the black market and his familiarity with the clock's lock made him a strong candidate, but Roger and Clara's clandestine meeting suggested a web of secrets that might entangle others. As she reached her room, Miss Marple paused by the window, gazing out at the moonlit lawn. The manor, with its ancient stones and hidden corners, was a maze of motives, each suspect a thread in a tapestry, yet to be fully woven. Roger's debts, Clara's charm, Lyle's expertise, Graves's loyalty. All were pieces of a puzzle that centered on the missing clock. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead theft, where a whispered confession in a churchyard had led her to the culprit, a man whose guilt was masked by a tangle of village gossip. Here, the gossip was quieter, but the secrets were no less potent. Miss Marple settled into an armchair by her bedside, her knitting basket untouched for once. She adjusted her spectacles, her mind sifting through the night's revelation. Roger and Clara's secret, whatever it was, complicated their alibi, but did not directly implicate them in the theft. Yet it weakened their story, leaving room for doubt. She resolved to press Clara further, perhaps in a more casual setting, to see if her charm would crack under gentle scrutiny. And Lyle, with his nervous cufflinks and black market knowledge, warranted closer attention, as did Graves, whose silence might hide more than loyalty. The clock's absence was a wound to Greystone Manor, its chimes silenced, but its mystery alive. Miss Marple's village wisdom, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that the truth lay in the small moments, the whispered words, the unguarded glances, the smudges left behind. She would watch and listen and knit the threads together until the thief's mask fell away and the Ormolu clock was restored to its rightful place. Chapter 10. The Appraiser's Slip. The breakfast room at Greystone Manor was a bright, airy space, its walls adorned with pale green wallpaper and portraits of long-dead Winthrops enjoying bucolic pursuits. The morning sun poured through wide windows, glinting off the silver coffee urn and the delicate china set out on a linen-draped table. The scent of fresh toast and kippers mingled with the faint tang of beeswax from the polished floor, but the atmosphere was subdued, the theft of the ormolu clock casting a pall over the household. Miss Jane Marple, seated at one end of the table with a cup of tea and a modest plate of scones, observed the gathered guests with her usual quiet acuity. Her lavender cardigan and sensible shoes made her appear as unthreatening as a village ant, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Mr. Percival Lyle, the antique appraiser, entered the room with his characteristic polish, his pinstriped suit crisp despite the early hour. His thin mustache twitched as he greeted Lady Eleanor with a nod, his cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted them. A nervous tick Miss Marple had come to recognize as a barometer of his unease. He took a seat opposite her, his movements precise, and helped himself to a slice of toast, though his fingers lingered on the butter knife, as if seeking something to occupy them. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked away for the moment, saw an opportunity to probe further into the appraiser's demeanor, which had grown increasingly suspect in light of the clues she had uncovered. "Good morning, Mr. Lyle," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze in St. Mary Mead. "I trust you slept well, despite the troubles of yesterday. Such a shock, the clock's disappearance." She sipped her tea, her eyes meeting his over the rim of her cup, her expression one of kindly interest. Lyle's smile was tight, his cufflinks glinting as he set the knife down. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he replied, his tone smooth but guarded. "Slept as well as one can in such circumstances. A dreadful loss for Lady Eleanor. The clock was a masterpiece, irreplaceable, really." He spread butter on his toast with exaggerated care, his eyes flicking briefly to the other guests. Roger Winthrop, nursing a coffee with a sullen air, Mrs. Clara Hemmings, radiant in a coral dress but unusually quiet, and Mr. Graves standing by the sideboard, his stoic presence a silent anchor. Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm but her mind alert. Lyle's quick emphasis on the clock's value echoed his comments in the study, and she recalled the waxy smudge on the glass case, a clue that pointed to a careful thief with knowledge of locks. "Irreplaceable, indeed," she said. "Though you mentioned its value on the market, quite a sum, I believe. It must be tempting for someone to spirit it away, perhaps to one of those private collectors you spoke of." Her tone was light, almost playful, but her words were a gentle prod, testing the waters of Lyle's composure. Lyle's knife paused mid-air, a fleck of butter clinging to its blade. "Tempting, perhaps, for a less scrupulous sort," he said, his laugh a touch too sharp. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, my work is valuation, not trafficking. The black market is a sordid business. Collectors who deal in stolen goods are hardly my circle." He set the knife down, his cufflinks flashing as he adjusted them, his eyes darting to the window as if seeking escape. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her teacup resting in its saucer. In St. Mary Mead, she had once questioned a jeweler's assistant who protested his innocence with similar vehemence, only to betray himself by over-explaining a detail only the guilty would know. Lyle's quick dismissal of the black market, coupled with his nervous tics, deepened her suspicion. She thought of the waxy smudge and the undisturbed lock, clues that suggested a thief with both access and skill, qualities Lyle possessed in abundance. "Of course," she said, her voice as soothing as a village lullaby. "Though I wonder, Mr. Lyle, how one might sell such a clock discreetly. You must hear whispers of such things in your line of work." Lyle's fork clattered against his plate, a small but telling sound in the quiet room. He recovered quickly, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "One doesn't, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained now. "Unless you know the right people, and I don't. My clients are reputable, my dealings transparent." He glanced at Roger and Clara, as if hoping to shift attention, but both were engrossed in their own thoughts, Roger staring into his coffee and Clara toying with a pearl earring. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Lyle's mention of the right people echoed his earlier comment about private collectors, a slip that betrayed a familiarity he was eager to deny. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Grocer, who had betrayed his guilt by over-explaining a delivery route, his words revealing knowledge he shouldn't have had. Lyle's nervous cufflink adjustments and his quick defensiveness were threads in a tapestry that pointed to more than professional interest in the clock. "Naturally," she said, her tone unchanged. "Though it's curious, isn't it? How a clock like that could vanish without a trace, almost as if someone knew its lock intimately, perhaps from studying it closely during an appraisal." Lyle's face paled, and his hand froze on his cufflink, the gold glinting like a warning. "The lock was standard," he said, his voice a fraction too loud. "I noted it in my appraisal. Nothing special, just a brass pin tumbler. Anyone could have opened it with a bit of skill." He caught himself, his eyes narrowing as he realized he'd said too much, and he forced a laugh. "Not that I'd know about such things, of course. I'm no locksmith." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression as serene as a village pond. Lyle's slip about the lock's mechanism was a small but significant crack in his polished façade, confirming her suspicion that his expertise extended beyond valuation. The waxy smudge on the case, the disturbed dust in the drawing room, and now Lyle's unguarded comment about the lock, all pointed to a thief with both opportunity and skill. In her village, she had once caught a thief by noting his casual mention of a safe's combination, a detail only the culprit would know. Lyle's knowledge, she thought, was his undoing. She set her cup down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "How fascinating," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "You must see such intricate mechanisms in your work. I remember a case in my village, a stolen locket, taken from a locked box. The thief had made a wax impression of the key, you see? Quite a clever trick, though it left a telltale smudge." She paused, watching Lyle's reaction, her eyes soft but unyielding. Lyle's cufflinks glinted as his hand trembled slightly, and he pushed his plate away, his appetite evidently gone. "A wax impression?" he said, his tone dismissive but his eyes wary. "An old-fashioned method, hardly used these days. Besides, the drawing room was locked, wasn't it? Mr. Graves is certain of that." He glanced at the butler, who stood silently by the sideboard, his face impassive, but his eyes flickering toward Lyle. Miss Marple nodded, her smile unchanged. "Indeed, Mr. Graves is most diligent, though small clues, like a smudge or a misplaced object, can tell such a story, don't you think?" She rose, smoothing her cardigan, her movements slow and deliberate. "I mustn't keep you from your work, Mr. Lyle, I'm sure the constable will value your insights." Lyle stood, his nod curt, his cufflinks flashing as he adjusted them one last time. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, and he left the room with a haste that belied his usual composure. Miss Marple remained, her thoughts as orderly as her knitting. Lyle's slip about the lock, his nervous tics, and his repeated mentions of the black market painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge of guilt. The waxy smudge, the disturbed dust, and the undisturbed lock all pointed to a thief with Lyle's expertise, but she needed more to confirm her suspicions. Roger and Clara's whispered meeting in the billiards room suggested a separate secret, one that weakened their alibi, but did not directly implicate them in the theft. Graves, with his hesitation over the keys, remained a quiet enigma, his loyalty a potential shield for another's guilt. She glanced at the breakfast table, where Roger and Clara now sat in awkward silence, and at Graves, who moved with silent efficiency to clear a plate. The clock's absence was a wound, its mystery a challenge, and Miss Marple, with her village wisdom and patient observation, felt the threads of truth drawing closer. She resolved to set a trap, to coax the thief into revealing themselves, and she knew just the bait to use. The ormolu clock, with its silent chimes, was calling, and Miss Marple was ready to answer with a plan as subtle as her knitting. Chapter 11. The Trap is Set. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Greystone Manor's drawing room, where the empty glass case stood as a silent accusation, its velvet lining stark without the ormolu clock's golden presence. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan neatly buttoned, stood beside Lady Eleanor Winthrop, her knitting basket tucked under her arm like a trusted confidant. The room was quiet, the household's earlier bustle giving way to a tense anticipation as Constable Harris's search of the manor continued elsewhere. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, surveyed the space, lingering on the waxy smudge and the faint circle in the dust. She had noted earlier clues that pointed to a careful thief, one whose expertise she now believed centered on Mr. Percival Lyle. Yet, as she had learned in St. Mary Mead, the truth often required a nudge to reveal itself, and she had a plan to provide just that. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as the fading light, "I've been thinking about the clock. It's such citours." The household was summoned to the drawing room, a gathering of family, guests, and staff, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Lady Eleanor, her navy dress lending her a quiet dignity, stood before the empty case, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her loss. "I've had news from a colleague in London," she announced, her eyes sweeping the room. Mr. Lyle's initial appraisal overlooked something, a hidden compartment in the clock's base containing a rare sapphire, a family secret known only to my father and me. Its value is considerable, perhaps even greater than the clock itself. We're organizing a thorough search of the grounds and outbuildings tomorrow at dawn. The room stirred, a ripple of murmurs passing through the gathered group. Roger Winthrop, slouched near the fireplace, straightened, his dark eyes narrowing as he exchanged a glance with Mrs. Clara Hemmings, who stood poised by the window, her coral dress vibrant, but her expression guarded. Mr. Graves, stationed by the door, clasped his hands behind his back, his face as unreadable as ever, though his posture stiffened slightly. Mr. Lyle, standing near the sideboard, froze, his hand halfway to his cufflinks, his face paling as if the room's air had thinned. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, watched them all, her needles clicking softly, her mind alert to every flicker of reaction. Lyle recovered first, his voice smooth but strained. "A sapphire, you say? Extraordinary. I examined the clock thoroughly, but such compartments can be devilishly clever. I'd be happy to assist with the search, Lady Eleanor." His cufflinks glinted as he adjusted them, the gesture more pronounced than usual, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his fingers, like a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who had betrayed his guilt by fidgeting with his apron. Eleanor inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Lyle. We'll need all hands tomorrow. The sapphire is a family treasure, and I trust it's still within reach." She dismissed the group with a nod, and they dispersed, their murmurs trailing like smoke. Roger and Clara lingered, their heads bent in quiet conversation, while Graves moved to adjust the curtains, his movements precise but his eyes distant. Lyle excused himself with a curt bow, his steps quick as he left the room. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a pretext for lingering, her thoughts racing. The ruse of the sapphire was a gamble, designed to unsettle the thief and prompt a hasty move. In St. Mary Mead, she had once flushed out a thief by spreading a rumor of a hidden letter in a stolen book, prompting the culprit to check their hiding place. Lyle's reaction, his pallor, his trembling hands, confirmed her suspicions, but she needed evidence to seal the trap. She rose, her knitting tucked away, and slipped into the hall, her sensible shoes silent on the carpet. The manor was a labyrinth of shadows at this hour, the electric lamps casting pools of light that did little to banish the darkness. Miss Marple moved with purpose, her village instincts guiding her toward the stables, a place rarely visited by guests, but ideal for concealing something as bulky as the clock. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Farmer, who had hidden stolen goods in a hayloft, thinking it beyond scrutiny, and wondered if Lyle had made a similar miscalculation. The stables were across the courtyard, their wooden doors weathered but sturdy, and she approached with caution, her small frame blending into the dusk. As she neared, a faint rustle caught her ear, a sound too deliberate for the wind. She paused behind a hedge, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw Lyle emerge from the manor, his pinstriped suit incongruous against the rustic setting. He carried a small lantern, its glow muted, and his steps were hurried, his head turning to scan the courtyard. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene, her years of village observation teaching her the value of patience. Lyle slipped into the stables, the door creaking softly as it closed behind him. She waited, counting the seconds as she had once counted stitches in a complex pattern, then crept closer, her movements as silent as a cat in a St. Mary Mead garden. Through a crack in the stable door, she saw Lyle kneeling beside a tarp-covered crate, his lantern casting a flickering light on his tense face. He lifted the tarp, revealing a wooden box marked with a London address. A dealer's name, Miss Marple noted, one known for discreet transactions. Lyle opened the box, and there, wrapped in soft cloth, was the ormolu clock, its golden curves gleaming like a captured star. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her suspicions confirmed. She stepped back, her mind racing to summon Constable Harris without alerting Lyle. She recalled a village boy who had fled when caught with stolen apples, and she knew speed was essential. Moving swiftly, she returned to the manor, her steps light but purposeful, and found Harris in the library, poring over his notes. "Constable," she said, her voice low but urgent, "you'll want to come to the stables at once. Bring a man or two, quietly. I believe you'll find what you're looking for." Her eyes twinkled, but her tone carried the weight of certainty, honed by years of unraveling village mysteries. Harris, his round face creasing with surprise, nodded and signaled two of his men, who followed with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to sudden calls. They crossed the courtyard, the moon now high, casting a silver light that made the stables loom like a stage for the final act. As they approached, Lyle emerged, his lantern extinguished, his face a mask of panic as he saw the approaching figures. He bolted, his cufflinks clattering to the ground in his haste, a small but damning detail that Miss Marple noted with satisfaction. "Stop there, Mr. Lyle," Harris called, his voice booming across the courtyard. His men were quicker, their boots pounding the gravel as they apprehended Lyle before he reached the gate. He struggled briefly, his polished demeanor crumbling, but the constables were firm, leading him back to the stables where the crate stood exposed. Miss Marple followed at a slower pace, her knitting basket left behind, but her mind as sharp as her needles. The clock, retrieved from its hiding place, was a triumph, its chimes silent, but its presence a testament to her plan's success. Lyle's capture was the final stitch in a pattern she had begun to weave the moment she saw the waxy smudge, and she felt a quiet satisfaction, like finishing a complex scarf in her St. Mary Mead parlor. As Harris inspected the crate, his notebook open, Miss Marple stood by, her lavender cardigan a soft contrast to the night's drama. "Well done, Miss Marple," Harris said, his tone grudging but respectful. "You've a knack for this. I'll give you that." She smiled, her eyes crinkling with the warmth of a village aunt. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with too much time to think, Constable," she said, her voice as gentle as ever. "But people, you know, are much the same everywhere. Their secrets slip out if you know where to look." She glanced at Lyle, now subdued, his cufflinks lost in the gravel, and knew the final chapter of the clock's mystery was near. Chapter 12. The Truth Revealed. The drawing room at Greystone Manor was bathed in the soft glow of evening lamps, their light reflecting off the polished oak floor and the newly restored ormolu clock, which once again stood proudly in its glass case. The room, so recently a scene of shock and suspicion, now held an air of resolution, though the tension of the past days lingered like a faint echo. Lady Eleanor Winthrop, her navy dress replaced by a somber black gown, stood beside the clock, her hand resting lightly on the case as if to reassure herself of its return. The household, family, guests, and servants had gathered at her request, their faces a mixture of relief, curiosity, and in one case, barely concealed dread. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting basket, her lavender cardigan blending into the room's muted elegance, observed the assembly with her characteristic, quiet acuity. Her needles clicked softly, a rhythmic accompaniment to the unfolding denouement. Constable Harris stood near the fireplace, his round face flushed with the satisfaction of a case nearing its close. Beside him, Mr. Percival Lyle sat in a straight-backed chair, his pinstriped suit slightly rumpled, his hands cuffed, his once polished demeanor replaced by a sullen resignation. The ormolu clock, retrieved from its hiding place in the stables, gleamed as if untouched by its brief absence, its golden curves catching the light like a silent witness to the drama. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in every detail: the clock's restored presence, Lyle's defeated posture, and the subtle glances exchanged among the others. Roger Winthrop's restless fidgeting, Mrs. Clara Hemmings's guarded poise, and Mr. Graves's stoic vigilance by the door. Lady Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the ordeal. Thanks to Miss Marple's insight and Constable Harris's diligence, our family's treasure has been returned, she said, her eyes resting on the clock. But the truth of its theft must be told, for the sake of clarity and justice. Jane, will you explain? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her movements slow and deliberate, as if arranging the final stitches of a complex pattern. She rose, her small figure commanding the room's attention, despite her unassuming appearance. "It's a simple matter, really," she began, her voice as gentle as a St. Mary Mead tea party. "Though people's motives are rarely as simple as they seem. The theft of the clock was a careful act, planned with precision, but human nature, you see, always leaves a trace." She stepped toward the glass case, her fingers brushing the air near the waxy smudge she had first noticed. "It began with a small clue," she said, her eyes meeting Lyle's, who looked away, his jaw tight. A smudge of candle wax on the case's inner edge, where no candle should have been needed in a house with electric lights. It suggested a thief working in the dark, cautious not to be seen. Then there was the dust on a nearby table, disturbed in a circle the size of the clock's base, as if it had been set down briefly during the theft. And the lock, undisturbed without a scratch, pointed to someone with a key or a clever imitation. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of the clock, its chimes restored but not yet sounded. Roger Winthrop shifted in his seat, his dark eyes darting to Clara, who sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her coral dress a bright contrast to her pale face. Graves stood motionless, his gray eyes fixed on Miss Marple, a flicker of respect in their depths. "Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple continued, her tone as calm as a village pond, "you were the natural suspect. Your expertise as an appraiser gave you intimate knowledge of the clock, its value, its mechanism, its lock. At dinner you spoke of private collectors and the black market, a detail too specific to be idle talk. In the study, you described the lock as a simple brass pin tumbler, a fact you dismissed but which betrayed your familiarity. And at breakfast, when I mentioned a wax impression, your reaction, a trembling hand, a quick denial, confirmed my suspicions." Lyle's lips parted, but no words came. His cufflinks, now absent, left his wrists bare, a small but telling detail of his fall from grace. Miss Marple's eyes softened, as if addressing a wayward parishioner in St. Mary Mead. "You used your appraisal to study the lock, didn't you? A wax impression, taken discreetly, allowed you to craft a duplicate key. You stole the clock at night, using a candle for light, and hid it in the stables, in a crate marked for a London dealer, known for discreet transactions. The sapphire ruse, my little invention, prompted you to check your hiding place, and that, Mr. Lyle, was your undoing." A murmur ran through the room, and Lyle's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. "I needed the money," he muttered, his voice low but audible. "Debts, bad investments. The clock was my way out. I knew a buyer in Paris, no questions asked. I never meant to hurt anyone." His confession hung in the air, a stark contrast to his earlier polish, and Harris nodded, scribbling in his notebook. Miss Marple turned to the others, her gaze sweeping the room. "But there were other threads to untangle," she said. "Mr. Winthrop, your debts made you a suspect, and your alibi with Mrs. Hemings was vague, weakened by your late-night meeting in the billiards room. I overheard your whispers. It wasn't about the clock," Mrs. Hemings said. "Your secret, I suspect, is a personal matter, perhaps an indiscretion, but it clouded your story." Roger flushed, his hands clenching, while Clara's eyes dropped to her lap, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "It's true," Roger admitted, his voice rough. "Clara and we've been close, too close. We were hiding that, not the theft. I swear I didn't touch the clock." Clara nodded, her face a mask of shame, but her silence confirmed his words. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Graves, who stood like a sentinel by the door. "And you, Mr. Graves," she said gently. "Your loyalty to the family is unquestionable, but your hesitation over the keys suggested you knew more than you said. I believe you suspected Mr. Lyle, perhaps saw him lingering near the drawing room, but your duty to Lady Eleanor kept you silent, didn't it? You wished to protect the family's reputation." Graves's face remained impassive, but his eyes softened, a rare crack in his stoic façade. "I saw Mr. Lyle near the drawing room that night," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought it odd, but I had no proof. I couldn't accuse a guest without cause." His hands unclenched, a gesture of relief, as if a burden had lifted. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand still on the clock's case. "Thank you, Jane," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You've restored more than our clock. You've restored our peace." She turned to the group, her gaze firm. "This matter is closed, but let it be a lesson. Trust is a fragile thing, easily broken." Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm as she sat. "People are much the same everywhere," she said softly, as if to herself. "In my village, I've seen greed, loyalty, and secrets, just as here. They leave their marks, if you know where to look." She glanced at the clock, its golden curves gleaming, and felt a quiet satisfaction, like finishing a scarf in her St. Mary Mead parlor. Harris cleared his throat, motioning for his men to take Lyle away. "We'll handle it from here, Miss Marple," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "You've a knack for this, I'll say that." As the room emptied, Roger and Clara slipping away with downcast eyes, Graves resuming his duties, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a quiet companion. The clock chimed softly, its melody a reminder of time's steady march and the truths it revealed. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small clues, a dropped hairpin, a whispered word, had unraveled many a mystery. Here, in the grandeur of Greystone Manor, the same truths held, and Miss Marple, with her village wisdom and patient observation, had woven them into clarity once more.